The first fact is about the human brain. It weighs around 1.3 to 1.5 kilograms, which is about 2% of a person's body weight. Yet, it requires a much larger share of energy. When the body is at rest, the brain uses approximately 1/5 of all the oxygen and glucose consumed. This high energy usage is because of its constant electrical activity and the work needed to keep ions on the membranes of neurons. The brain is protected by several layers: the hard skull, three membranes, the fluid that cushions it, and the blood-brain barrier. This barrier lets nutrients in but keeps blood from directly touching the brain tissue. A key point is that the brain itself has no pain receptors. This means neurosurgeons can operate while the patient is under local anesthesia and the patient won't feel pain in the cortex. The pain we feel comes from receptors in the membranes and blood vessels, not from the brain cells themselves. The second fact reveals that the brain is estimated to have around 86 billion neurons. Moreover, glial cells like astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, and microglia are likely present in much greater numbers. Neurons communicate via millions of billions of synapses. Estimates span from hundreds of trillions to a quadrillion contacts. This network is in a state of flux, with contacts strengthening, weakening, disappearing, and reforming. Myelin, applied by oligodendrocytes to insulate axons, allows signals to accelerate to tens and, in larger fibers, to roughly 120 meters per second. Astrocytes are responsible for regulating the chemical surroundings, redistributing energy, and playing a role in signal transmission. Microglia, functioning as the immune patrol, constantly surveys the tissue and clears away debris, including synapses marked for removal. This is less like wiring and maintenance and more akin to a living city with its own infrastructure. Fact 3. Plasticity is a core attribute of the brain, allowing it to modify itself through experience at every level, from synaptic strength to cortical maps. Through processes of long-term potentiation and depression, connections are either reinforced or weakened based on their correlated activity. The brain's maps of the body and sensory inputs undergo restructuring. For example, a musician's finger, heavily used over years of practice, results in an enlarged representation of that area in the cortex. Research indicates that navigators have experienced growth in their posterior hippocampus, which is related to spatial memory. The question of neurogenesis in adult humans remains a topic of discussion. While it has been confirmed in animals, many human studies find evidence of it in the hippocampus, but its degree and functional role are debated. Importantly, plasticity is not limited to childhood, but is a resource for the entire lifespan, although the cost of changes tends to increase with age. The fourth point debunks popular myths, like the notion of using only 10% of the brain or the existence of left-brained artists. Neuroimaging and clinical observations reveal that all brain areas are active throughout the day, with intensity levels changing. If a small area is deactivated, a deficit arises. Functional asymmetry is a reality. Most right-handed individuals show left hemisphere dominance for speech, while the right hemisphere is often more proficient in spatial tasks and processing intonation. However, these are not two separate personalities. They are a tightly connected system joined by the corpus callosum. Creative and logical operations are distributed across a network of nodes in both hemispheres. Individual differences are substantial, and learning can shift how hemispheres participate depending on the skill being learned. Fact number 5 explains that sleep is not an off state, but rather an active phase of reorganization and cleanup. During the slow-wave sleep stage, the flow of cerebrospinal fluid is enhanced and the glymphatic system functions actively. This system widens the channels between cells, leading to more efficient removal of metabolic waste, including surplus beta-amyloid. Overnight, the brain revisits its daily activity patterns, which is believed to contribute to memory consolidation. This process involves strengthening facts and skills, reducing superfluous connections, and stabilizing essential ones. Insufficient sleep negatively impacts attention, decision-making abilities, and emotional regulation. Chronic sleep deprivation is associated with a greater likelihood of metabolic and neurodegenerative diseases. Caffeine can disguise sleepiness by blocking adenosine receptors, but it does not replace the actual need for sleep or correct the errors that occur in synaptic editing. Sixth fact: electrical signals in the brain become chemical at the axon's end. Mediators are released into the synaptic cleft, connecting with receptors on the next cell. Key players are glutamate, which excites, and GABA, which inhibits. Modulators like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine also participate. These don't primarily start signals, but rather adjust network sensitivity and the noise-to-signal ratio. A mediator's action differs based on the receptor. For example, glutamate's AMPA and NMDA receptors have different timing, affecting learning. Volume transmission also happens, where mediators spread out, influencing nearby synapses. How a molecule is handled, quickly broken down by enzymes or taken back into the terminal, finely tunes how long its effect lasts. Problems in this process can impact attention, mood, and motor control. The seventh point is that memory is not built up in layers like an archive, but rather reconstructed by a network of areas. Episodic memory is supported by the hippocampus, which functions as an index that links event details together. Semantic memory is based on spread-out cortical zones where the meanings of words and facts are stored. Procedural memory, concerning skills, is reinforced in the basal ganglia and cerebellum, where prediction errors fine-tune movements until they become automatic. Working memory, a buffer for a few seconds, relies on the prefrontal cortex and its connections to sensory areas. Forgetting is not a glitch, but a form of saving resources. Connections that are seldom used are weakened. In addition, memories are flexible and can be distorted, which is demonstrated in experiments with fake details. Smells have the ability to easily retrieve past scenes because olfactory pathways are directly connected to the amygdala and hippocampus, bypassing the thalamus. The eighth fact states that the brain develops in stages, like waves. First, the neural tube is created. Next, neurons move along radial glia structures, forming the layers of the cortex. After this, there is a burst of synapse formation, followed by many years of cutting back extra connections. The teenage years are when the prefrontal networks for self-control and judging risks are rebuilt. This is why impulsivity and wanting new things are biologically understandable. There are specific times, called critical and sensitive periods, when vision, hearing, and speech learn to adjust to what's happening in the environment. If these senses don't get enough stimulation during these periods, it causes lasting problems. However, a stimulating environment helps these functions mature faster. Learning can also temporarily make adults' brains more adaptable, especially if they practice intentionally and get enough sleep. Things like not having enough iodine during pregnancy, alcohol, or lead can mess up the brain's development plan. That's why preventing these issues and intervening early is very effective. Ninth fact: pain isn't just a damage signal. It's the outcome of a dialogue between upward and downward pathways. Expectations, fears, and attention can make pain feel stronger or weaker. For instance, a placebo triggers the body's own pain relief system and areas like the periaqueductal brake. A nocebo, however, makes suffering worse by increasing anxiety. The amygdala adds a sense of threat to pain, the insula handles the physical feeling of it, and the anterior cingulate cortex drives the motivation to cope, whether that means enduring, escaping, or calling for help. When pain becomes chronic, the network's sensitivity changes. Nerve cells start reacting to milder triggers, and the mental map of the body can get warped. This is why approaches that involve multiple disciplines, like physical activity, mental exercises, and good sleep, are effective. They readjust the system from the brain down instead of just trying to block the signal from the body's edge. Fact number 10. The cerebellum is commonly referred to as the conductor of movements, but its responsibilities are more extensive. It generates predictions about the sensory results of actions and juxtaposes these anticipated outcomes with actual sensory input, aiming to minimize discrepancies. This operational model is applicable not only to motor control, such as adapting to wearing prism glasses or ensuring accurate speech articulation, but also to cognitive timing and flow. The precision of timing, the seamless transition of attention, and even the underlying rhythm of thought processes are improved when the cerebellum and frontal lobes function in concert. Damage to the cerebellum can lead to dysmetria in movements, manifesting as misjudgments and tremors, and also to a dysmetria of thought, which disrupts the natural flow of speech, the capacity for planning, and overall tempo. A vast network of hundreds of thousands of mossy and climbing fibers integrates sensory and cortical information, while Purkinje cells, which are the sole output pathway from the cerebellar cortex, meticulously control the inhibitory signaling. In this manner, the cerebellum converts imprecise signals into a highly accurate behavioral metronome. Fact 11. The blood-brain barrier is not a wall but a precisely calibrated border control. Its structure is based on endothelial cells of brain capillaries connected by tight junctions. Pericytes and astrocyte processes are attached to these junctions, and together they control what enters and what is immediately expelled. Glucose moves through the GLUT1 transporter, some amino acids via systems like LAT1. Iron through the transferrin receptor, PERMIT, and lipophilic molecules can pass by diffusion. Pumps such as P-glycoprotein eject unwanted substances back into the blood. There are exceptions such as circumventricular zones, subfornical organ, subcommissural organ, and pineal gland where the barrier is weaker and the brain tests blood composition. In clinical settings, the barrier hinders drug delivery. It is temporarily opened osmotically with mannitol or with focused ultrasound and microbubbles. During inflammation or ischemia, it becomes more permeable, changing the disease's presentation and the response to treatment. Fact 12. The brain communicates via rhythms. Electroencephalography captures delta waves of deep sleep, roughly 0.5 to 4 Hz. Theta waves for navigation and hippocampal coding are about 4 to 8 Hz. Alpha waves in the occipital region at rest are 8 to 12 Hz. Beta activity for state retention is 13 to 30 Hz. Gamma oscillations accompanying feature binding and attention exceed 30 Hz. These ranges are not fixed channels, but helpful labels. Area synchronization is more critical. A slow wave's phase can carry a fast wave's amplitude. Theta-gamma phase amplitude coupling in the hippocampus correlates with long-term memory. Alpha suppression in the cortex enhances processing in a chosen visual field spot. Too much beta in the basal ganglia means motor stiffness. MEG detects the magnetic traces of these rhythms with high millisecond accuracy. Epilepsy shows hypersynchronization. A network gets stuck in a bad unison, making the rhythm a whip instead of a coordinator. Fact number 13. Dopamine serves not as a pleasure hormone, but as an indicator of reward prediction error. Should the reward received be greater than anticipated, neurons in the ventral tegmental area increase their firing rate. If it is less, their activity is reduced. This is how the brain recalibrates the value assigned to actions and stimuli. Multiple pathways are involved. The mesolimbic pathway extends to the nucleus accumbens and regulates the drive to pursue. The mesocortical pathway impacts the prefrontal cortex's assessment of options. And the nigrostriatal pathway, extending from the substantia nigra to the striatum, is crucial for learning habits and achieving movement precision. The degeneration of this pathway is the root cause of Parkinson's disease, manifesting as slowed movements and tremor. L-DOPA provides temporary compensation for the deficit but may induce dyskinesias. Psychostimulants interfere with dopamine transport (DAT), enhancing the signal. while drugs indirectly elevate the probability of an outcome being better than expected, reinforcing associated behaviors. The difference between the tonic motivation level and phasic surprise spikes is important for determining one's inclination towards exploration and persistence. Fact number 14. Language functions as a network, not just two distinct areas like Broca's and Wernicke's. The ventral stream, which involves connections between the temporal and frontal lobes, is responsible for linking sounds to their meanings. The dorsal stream, utilizing the arcuate fasciculus, connects sounds to articulation and working memory. Broca's area, located in the inferior frontal gyrus, is vital for syntax and the sequential coordination of speech movements, but it collaborates with the premotor and parietal cortices. Wernicke's area, found in the posterior sections of the superior temporal gyrus, is important for phonology and vocabulary. Damage to these areas results in different forms of aphasia. Broca-type aphasia leads to sparse and stiff, while Wernicke-type aphasia produces fluent but empty speech. The right hemisphere contributes to prosody and the understanding of humorous undertones. In bilingual individuals, the same neural nodes are activated under the control of the anterior cingulate and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Consistent practice leads to denser white matter in the relevant tracts, accelerating information exchange. Reading utilizes the visual word form area in the left fusiform gyrus. This area is not inherent, but is an adapted region of the visual system that has been reconfigured for processing letters. The 15th fact. Vision starts in the retina. Rods in the retina capture low light levels, and cones distinguish different wavelengths of light. The fovea, a central indentation, has the highest density of cones, explaining why we aim our gaze there with microsaccades. Where the optic nerve fibers exit the eye is the blind spot. The brain quietly fills in what is missing. The visual information then proceeds through the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus to the primary visual cortex, V1. In V1, neurons are specialized for detecting the orientation and position of contours, forming a retinotopic map. From V1, two main processing streams emerge. The ventral stream, known as the what pathway, involving temporo-occipital regions, is responsible for recognizing objects and faces. The dorsal stream, the where-how pathway, involving parieto-occipital regions, handles spatial awareness and guiding actions. Damage to V1 can cause blind spot, a condition where a person is unaware of visual stimuli but can still indicate their direction using subcortical pathways. Illusions occur not because of eye mistakes, but because the visual system actively anticipates the world, sometimes making assumptions before all the data has arrived. Fact 16. The process of hearing originates in the cochlea, a spiral organ. A wave traveling on the basilar membrane within the cochlea sorts complex sounds by their frequencies. High frequencies resonate at the base and low frequencies at the apex. Mechanical movement of the stereocilia on hair cells opens ion channels, transforming vibration into an electrical signal for the auditory nerve. In the brainstem, specifically the superior olivary complex, binaural processing takes place. Minute differences in timing and intensity between the ears enable the determination of the sound source's direction. Subsequently, the information is relayed to the inferior colliculi, then via the medial geniculate body of the thalamus to the primary auditory cortex, where a tonotopic map is maintained. Damage to the outer hair cells causes sound to be perceived as unclear or dirty. Chronic exposure to noise leads to neural network adaptation and tinnitus, described as a phantom ringing. A cochlear implant bypasses the hair cells, delivering coded electrical current directly to the auditory nerve through a series of electrodes. While it does not restore the natural timbre, it provides understandable speech and the opportunity to hear the world again. The 17th fact highlights olfaction as one of the few sensory pathways that directly connect to the cortex, bypassing the thalamus. Receptor neuron axons, situated in the nasal epithelium and undergoing regular renewal, extend to the olfactory bulb and then further to the amygdala, hippocampus, and orbitofrontal cortex. This mechanism accounts for why smells can instantaneously evoke memory frames. Each receptor is capable of recognizing a broad family of molecules, and the brain synthesizes a scent code based on the activity pattern of glomeruli. Taste perception, conversely, is organized differently. The primary taste qualities, sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, are encoded by receptors on the tongue and palate. These signals are conveyed via the facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves to the brainstem, proceeding to the thalamus and insular cortex. A large part of what we refer to as the taste of a meal is in reality retronasal olfaction, the flow of aromas from the mouth towards the cribriform plate. During a common cold, taste perception is reduced due to the diminished olfactory input. Anosmia, or the loss of smell, can alter dietary behavior and compromise safety by eliminating our early detection of smoke, gas, and spoiled foods. Fact 18 focuses on the basal ganglia. This system forms a loop connecting the frontal cortex, striatum, pallidum subthalamic nucleus, thalamus, and returning to the frontal cortex. Its role is to adjust the selection of actions and their associated energy levels. Within the basal ganglia, a balance is maintained between the direct pathway, mediated by D1 receptors and acting like an accelerator, and the indirect pathway, involving D2 receptors and functioning as a brake. The direct pathway promotes the initiation of beneficial actions, while the indirect pathway suppresses competing stimuli and noise. Dopamine, which conveys information about reward prediction errors, fine-tunes synaptic connections, converting past attempts into future habits. Disruptions in the balance of these pathways lead to varied outcomes. In Parkinson's disease, the accelerator weakens, resulting in reduced and slowed movements. Conversely, Huntington's disease involves the destruction of a portion of the inhibitory pathway, causing involuntary movements known as hyperkinesias. Deep brain stimulation targeting the subthalamic nucleus or the internal segment of the globus pallidus can help to alleviate pathological rhythms and restore voluntary movement control. These fundamental principles are also relevant to cognitive decision-making. We filter options to conserve effort, and the inherent cost of an action is established directly within these neural loops. Fact 19. Attention functions not as a single spotlight, but as a coordinated team with distinct roles. The orienting network, comprising the superior colliculi and parietal cortex, facilitates rapid shifts in gaze and priority assignment. The executive network, involving the anterior cingulate and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is responsible for inhibiting distractions and sustaining task pulls. The thalamus, specifically the pulvinar nucleus, synchronizes communication among visual processing areas. Manifestations such as inattentional blindness and change blindness highlight that without dedicated resource allocation, the brain may fail to perceive even significant alterations in visual stimuli. Multitasking typically involves rapid task switching, with each switch consuming tens to hundreds of milliseconds and contributing to increased error rates. The default mode network, encompassing the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, and angular gyrus, is active during periods of mind-wandering and self-referential thought. For task engagement, it must be superseded by the frontoparietal network. Attention training, incorporating adequate sleep, single-tasking, monotasking, time-boxing, and strategic breaks, enhances attentional resilience, though biological limitations preclude unending focus. 20th fact. Emotions are organized along a circuit. The amygdala swiftly gauges a stimulus's relevance and develops fear responses. The insula adds a bodily weight to an experience. The hypothalamus activates physiological and hormonal outputs. The orbitofrontal and medial prefrontal cortex evaluate potential outcomes and assume regulatory control. Stress acts as a temporary assistant, but also a risky companion. The hypothalamus releases CRH, the pituitary gland releases ACTH, and the adrenal glands release cortisol. In acute situations, this mobilizes resources and attention. However, chronic stress erodes sleep, immunity, and the hippocampus's flexibility, degrading memory for context. Emotion is distinct from behavior. We might feel fear, but still advance through top-down regulation. Social cues, such as glances, vocal tones, and facial movements, are deciphered by the social brain network, which encompasses the temporal sulci and medial prefrontal cortex. Neuropeptides, such as oxytocin, influence trust and attachment, but their effects are contingent on context and do not render people kinder with a switch. Fact 21st. Wakefulness and attention systems are powered by a range of modulators, not a single fuel. The brainstem's locus coeruleus releases norepinephrine, boosting cortical gain by making neurons more sensitive to important signals and quieting noise. The basal forebrain releases acetylcholine, which loosens cortical rhythms, helps rearrange synapses, and maintains focus. During sleep, acetylcholine levels are high in REM and low in deep slow-wave sleep. Norepinephrine is better for spotting novelty and immediate reactions, while acetylcholine is for fine-tuning plasticity and detail-oriented attention. The locus coeruleus's activity is indirectly tracked by pupil dilation, showing a stable correlation. In clinical practice, drug effects demonstrate this. Anticholinergics blur memory and attention. Cholinesterase inhibitors can improve speech and daily functions in dementia. Beta blockers soften emotional spikes, weakening the encoding of emotional events. Fact 22nd. Glia, the brain's silent partner, is actively engaged. Astrocytes, with their terminal feet, envelop synapses, manage ion and mediator concentrations, and establish a tripartite synapse with neurons. Within this connection, their calcium waves modulate signal transfer. Glycogen, an emergency energy reserve, is stored in their processes, yielding lactate. This lactate, conveyed by the astrocyte neuron shuttle, energizes active neural circuits under high demand. Oligodendrocytes myelinate numerous axons concurrently, accelerating potential propagation across Ranvier nodes. Myelin's thickness and span are malleable, adapting with experience to refine timing synchronization across brain areas. Microglia, functioning as immune sentinels, tag synapses for removal and clear debris from microdamage. In chronic inflammation, their watchful state can lead to extraneous noise. Post-injury, astrocytes generate a glial scar. This scar both insulates the lesion, preserving tissue, and obstructs regeneration, acting as a dual defense mechanism for a living entity. Fact 23rd. An influential concept views the brain as a prediction machine. It continuously constructs hypotheses about the world and compares them with incoming data, striving to minimize error. Higher-level brain regions generate expectations, while lower ones match sensory input to a draft. When reality diverges, a mismatch signal emerges, recognized in EEG as mismatch negativity. This explains the ease of perceiving speech in noisy environments and the tenacity of illusions. The system favors a stable hypothesis over a short-lived anomaly. The weight of data against expectations, or its accuracy, is tuned by modulators like norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and dopamine in certain models, connecting it to attention and learning. A loss of balance results in clinical presentations. If priors are given too much prominence, the world is fitted to beliefs, potentially leading to hallucinations. If data is overloaded with precision, every slight sound becomes a surprise. This is not a dogma, but a framework that impressively synthesizes brain behavior, rhythms, and errors. 24th fact. Current neuroimaging methods display indirect signs of brain activity, not thoughts on screen. fMRI measures the bold signal, which reflects changes in blood oxygen levels. This technique offers high spatial accuracy but limited temporal precision, as the signal is delayed by seconds. DTI tracks how water diffuses along nerve fibers, allowing for the reconstruction of white matter connections. PET, by using a radioactive marker, shows glucose metabolism, or the presence of proteins like amyloid and tau. Electro- and magnetoencephalography capture rapid field changes within milliseconds, while optical spectroscopy allows observation of the cortex in infants and during movement. Establishing causality requires intervention. TMS temporarily deactivates a brain region, demonstrating the network's altered behavior without it. A common error is reverse inference, wrongly linking a specific thought to an activated area. Reliability is improved by using large samples, pre-registering studies, and replicating findings. Fact 25th. Stroke, defined as an acute disruption of brain blood flow, manifests as either ischemic, where a blood vessel becomes blocked by a clot, or hemorrhagic, where a vessel ruptures, causing blood to infiltrate brain tissue. In ischemic cases, time is paramount. Clinical protocols confirm thrombolytics effectiveness within a restricted time frame of hours from symptom onset. Mechanical clot removal offers benefits later for specific patients, with earlier intervention increasing the likelihood of saving the penumbra surrounding the lesion. Recognizable signs include facial asymmetry, arm weakness, speech difficulties, and sudden unsteadiness. Immediate emergency medical services are necessary if these are present. Post-acute phase, a prolonged period of plasticity unfolds, wherein adjacent brain regions compensate for lost functions. This is facilitated by techniques like constraint-induced movement therapy for the healthy limb, intensive speech and motor rehabilitation, and sleep pattern normalization. Spasticity, depression, and fatigue are frequent sequelae, and comprehensive rehabilitation mitigates them, albeit requiring significant time and systemic support. The brain, while not miraculous, exhibits tenacity and the capacity for compensatory pathways. Fact 26th. The brain's internal timing mechanism resides in the suprachiasmatic nuclei of the hypothalamus, which are minute collections of neurons positioned above the intersection of the optic nerves. They receive direct input from the retina via specific ganglion cells that are responsive to blue light and possess the pigment melanopsin. This is why morning light is capable of adjusting the daily rhythm with greater precision than any alarm clock. These nuclei dictate the tempo of the hormonal axis. At night, the pineal gland elevates melatonin, body temperature declines, and tissues enter a state of repair. By dawn, cortisol and wakefulness increase. Temporal disruptions, such as shift work or flights across time zones, cause desynchronization of the pendulums in the liver, gut, and immune system. This leads to a situation where an individual is awake but their metabolism is still sleeping. Consequently, glucose absorption is impaired, mood fluctuates, and attention is compromised. The three main controls for reprogramming the rhythm are regularity of light, meals, and sleep. Even a short walk in the morning helps to shift the phases, while bright screens in the late evening produce the opposite outcome. Fact number 27. Activation in a cortical region is followed by altered blood flow, a phenomenon called neurovascular coupling. Neurons, interneurons, and astrocytes form a neurovascular unit. Glutamate causes calcium to rise in astrocyte extensions. These astrocytes then use nitric oxide, prostaglandins, and other vasodilators to slightly open arterioles, leading to increased blood flow, which in turn provides more oxygen and glucose. The bold signal in fMRI captures this. It reflects the equilibrium between oxygen consumption and supply, not the individual spikes. The autonomic system adds another layer of control. Cerebral autoregulation maintains perfusion relatively constant despite changes in blood pressure. CO2 levels fine-tune the diameter of blood vessels. For instance, a deeper breath causes cortical vessels to constrict. With advancing age and vascular risk factors, the neuron-vessel link becomes less responsive, negatively affecting attention and processing speed. Migraine with aura demonstrates the inverse. A wave of cortical depression is accompanied by a characteristic series of vascular changes. Fact 28. Intelligence does not reside in a single center and is not simply a matter of head size. The relationship between overall grain volume and cognitive test performance is modest and differs depending on the study groups. The structure of the network and its operational effectiveness are more significant. Nodes with unique connections in the frontoparietal areas, referred to as small world and rich club, are more prevalent in individuals possessing high cognitive flexibility and working memory. Cortical thickness and surface area exhibit different associations with various functions. The density of synapses is important in some instances, while the extent of neural maps is important in others. Myelination of neural pathways speeds up communication between nodes. Acquiring skills and undergoing education lead to noticeable alterations in white matter. Cognitive reserve, comprising habits, education, bilingualism, and social interaction, contributes to the prolonged preservation of functions despite comparable age-related alterations. This serves not as protection, but as a collection of alternative pathways. The neuromyth suggesting a large brain equals high genius fails to capture the more nuanced combination of genetics, environment, and experience. The 29th fact addresses readiness to move experiments that uncovered a paradox in the timing of volition. For a brief period before a person consciously registers the decision to move a finger, motor regions of the brain show a gradual increase in activity, referred to as the readiness potential. Contemporary research focusing on patterns within the frontoparietal cortex can anticipate a choice slightly before the subjective experience of now. This has ignited considerable debate. Does the brain eliminate free will? In a strict sense, the answer is no. The evidence pertains to statistical trends in simple, intentionally neutral decisions, and does not preclude the possibility of a veto function, where prefrontal areas inhibit an impulse that has already started. According to this perspective, conscious will functions not as an on switch, but as a quality control mechanism, evaluating the context, societal rules, and potential consequences. As tasks become more complex and planning horizons extend, the networks responsible for goals and stop signals play a more significant role. Neuroscience has not reduced decision-making to a reflex, but has illustrated the early and distributed nature of the precursors to our sense of "I have decided." Fact 30. The gut-brain link is a real network of channels, not just a figure of speech. The vagus nerve carries information about stretching and the chemical makeup of the gut contents to the brainstem. The gut microbiota produces short-chain fatty acids, vitamins, and tryptophan metabolites that can change immune responses and the gut barrier's permeability. Most serotonin is made in the gut's enterochromaffin cells, but it hardly gets through the blood-brain barrier. Its effect on the brain is through indirect routes: immune signals, the vagus nerve, and hormone cascades. In animal research, transferring microbiota changed anxiety and behavior. For people, data shows a small drop in subjective stress with some probiotics, but these effects are individual and not strong. A diet with fiber helps maintain microbial variety, which is indirectly tied to stable moods. Chronic gut inflammation, on the other hand, is linked to feeling tired and having mental fogginess. Two brains are close by, talking all the time. Fact 31. General anesthesia is not an off switch, but a subtle disruption of network coherence. Propofol and many inhaled anesthetics enhance GABAergic inhibition and change cortical rhythmicity. On EEG, powerful alpha activity appears around frontal leads along with slow waves. At deep doses, burst suppression occurs, where short bursts of activity alternate with silence. Ketamine acts differently, blocking NMDA receptors and causing a dissociative state with preserved reflexes and an unusual rhythm pattern. The common link is the disruption of thalamocortical loops, which normally integrate information into a single experience. Local anesthetics, like lidocaine, block voltage-dependent sodium channels peripherally and do not affect consciousness. An example of targeted intervention. Intraoperative awareness, when protocols are followed, is extremely rare. Controlled emergence is assessed by clinical signs, EEG indicators, and precise drug dosing. The 30-second fact. Hunger and satiety are a communication between the hypothalamus, the gut, and the reward system. The arcuate nucleus houses hungry neurons, AGRP/NPY, and satiated neurons, POMC/CART. Leptin and insulin act to suppress the former and activate the latter, while ghrelin from the stomach stimulates appetite. These signals, traveling through the paraventricular and lateral zones and the vagus nerve, modify metabolism and behavior. The orbitofrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens add a motivational aspect to food, creating a wanting sensation. Foods that are sweet and fatty and heavily processed provide quick calories and sensory hooks, increasing dopamine surges and leading to overeating when food is abundant. Stress, mediated by cortisol, favors fast carbohydrates. Chronic lack of sleep increases ghrelin and decreases leptin, thereby impairing self-control. In some patients, bariatric surgery reduces cravings not just mechanically, but also hormonally, by changing GLP-1 and other gut peptides. Mealtimes and morning light exposure synchronize internal rhythms, helping to preserve balance. The 33rd fact. Mirror neurons, defined as cells that become active when an action is performed and also when it is observed, were first documented in the premotor cortex of macaques in region F5. For humans, the mirror system is viewed as a dispersed network located in the inferior frontal and inferior parietal cortex, which aids in imitation, learning by watching, and recognizing gestures. A decrease in the mu rhythm above the motor cortex on an EEG when movements are seen is an indirect sign of this resonant functioning. However, there has been significant overstatement regarding it. The concepts that mirror neurons completely explain empathy or language are unsubstantiated, as emotions and speech are based on wider circuits that include limbic and frontotemporal hubs. The practical outcomes, conversely, are evident. Presenting movements hastens the acquisition of motor skills, and mirror therapy assists the brain in re-educating the body map for phantom limb pain, while the patient watches an illusory healthy hand in a mirror and synchronizes what is seen with a motor command. Fact 34th. Synesthesia is a stable cross-modal perception where, for example, numbers and letters have their own colors and sounds evoke visual forms. It's estimated that between a fraction of a percent and a few percent of people have it. The association maps are stable for years and pass objective consistency tests. A synesthete will more quickly name the correct color for their letter and more slowly for an incorrect one. Neuroimaging shows stronger connections between the word's visual form area and color-sensitive zones in the fusiform gyrus. There are theories about unfiltered pathways that are usually filtered in most people. Synesthesia can also occur after injuries or with psychedelic use, but these cases are rare and varied. In daily life, it doesn't make someone a genius, but gives unusual memory hooks. A phone becomes a drawing, a date a palette. It's important to distinguish it from metaphors. A warm sound is a figure of speech, not a neural interweaving of channels. The 35th fact states that the aging of the brain is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual alteration of its parameters. As individuals age, there is a decline in processing speed, in the nuanced aspects of working memory, and in the flexibility of task switching. Conversely, vocabulary and accumulated knowledge tend to be better preserved. At a microstructural level, there is a reduction in synapse density, alterations in myelin, and a decrease in cerebral blood flow, which results in increased noise and fatigue. A distinction exists between normal aging and neurodegeneration. In Alzheimer's disease, for example, episodic memory and orientation are affected early, amyloid and tau pathologies accumulate, and default mode networks are impaired. Age is identified as the principal risk factor, yet the trajectory of brain aging is also shaped by vascular health, sleep patterns, physical activity, the use of hearing aids when hearing is lost, social engagement, and the diversity of cognitive tasks undertaken. These factors contribute to the development of a reserve that facilitates longer compensation for damage. While prevention does not ensure complete protection, it can postpone the onset of symptoms and improve daily living. The early detection of mild cognitive impairments offers the opportunity for timely modifications to one's lifestyle and for obtaining necessary support. Fact 36. The brain's navigation relies on specific map cells. Within the hippocampus, place cells function. Each cell activates when an animal or person is in a certain location. The entorhinal cortex features grid cells with an impressive hexagonal field arrangement. These cells register travel distance and direction, maintaining internal odometry, the integration of a path. Also present are head direction cells, serving as a compass, boundary cells reacting to edges like walls and drops, and neurons associated with speed. Sequences, a series of flashes that depict a route, are logged under the theta rhythm. While sleeping and at rest, the hippocampus replays traveled routes, which is believed to aid in consolidating spatial memory. For humans, similar patterns are identified using MEG and EEG and intracerebral recordings. Changes within these networks emerge early in neurodegenerative diseases, resulting in poorer orientation and the loss of map anchors. The shape of a room can distort the grid step size, demonstrating the system's responsiveness to the world's form, not solely to steps and turns. Fact number 37. Epilepsy is defined by the brain's propensity for sudden, synchronized electrical discharges. Focal seizures begin in a specific brain region, for instance, the temporal lobe, manifesting as unusual odors, a sense of déjà vu, and a fixed gaze, accompanied by automatisms. Generalized tonic-clonic seizures result in falling, body rigidity, and rhythmic convulsions. Absences, which are brief episodes of lost consciousness in children, are characterized on EEG by classic 3 Hz spike wave complexes. Common triggers include insufficient sleep, abrupt alcohol withdrawal, and flickering lights in photosensitive individuals. A seizure lasting longer than 5 minutes is a critical condition, potentially leading to status epilepticus, and requires immediate medical attention. Treatment strategies involve anticonvulsant drugs such as sodium channel blockers, levetiracetam, which targets SV2A, and valproate, which enhances GABAergic transmission. In cases where medication is not effective, surgical resection of the seizure focus, vagus nerve stimulation, or adaptive neurostimulation are employed. A ketogenic diet has been shown to significantly reduce seizure frequency in some children. Prioritizing safety and the prevention of SUDEP, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, is essential, which entails consistent adherence to therapy and monitoring of nocturnal seizures. Fact 38. Autism spectrum disorders are a heterogeneous collection of developmental differences. The core difficulties lie in social communication and behavioral flexibility, coupled with unusual sensory sensitivities, which can manifest as hypersensitivity to sounds or a seeking of intense sensory experiences. Neurobiological descriptions point to altered excitation-inhibition balance, specific synaptic plasticity characteristics, and connectivity patterns where local networks might be more tightly connected while long-range connections are weaker, affecting signal integration. The genetic makeup is polygenic, ranging from common genetic variations to rare syndromes, for instance, issues with synaptic protein genes. Environmental factors can shape the developmental path but do not cause autism spectrum disorders independently. Early support, such as teaching communication skills, employing alternative communication methods, and organizing the environment, improves self-sufficiency. The success of these interventions is determined by the individual's specific profile, not by a generalized protocol. It is important to reject stigma, as many individuals, alongside their challenges, possess notable strengths like systemic thinking, meticulous attention to detail, and deep, consistent interests. The 39th fact: multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease of the central nervous system. It occurs when immune cells attack myelin, the insulating layer around nerve fibers produced by oligodendrocytes. This attack slows down nerve signal transmission and damages the nerve fibers themselves, axons. The most common form is relapsing remitting, meaning there are periods of symptom worsening, relapses, followed by recovery. Other forms include primary progressive and secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. The symptoms are varied and can include inflammation of the optic nerve, optic neuritis, causing pain when moving the eye and a feeling of blurred vision, numbness, problems with balance, muscle stiffness, spasticity, tiredness, a sensation of electric shocks down the spine when bending the neck, Lermit's sign, and a worsening of symptoms in hot weather, Uthoff's phenomenon. Diagnosis is made using MRI scans that show characteristic lesions in specific areas of the brain and spinal cord, such as around the fluid-filled spaces, periventricularly, and in the corpus callosum. Analysis of cerebrospinal fluid may also show oligoclonal IgG bands. Relapses are typically treated with high-dose corticosteroids. The long-term course of the disease can be altered by medications like interferons, glutatirimate acetate, drugs that affect the sphingosine 1-phosphate pathway, and monoclonal antibodies such as anti-CD20 therapies. It's important to consider potential side effects like progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, PML, which can occur with natalizumab. Rehabilitation programs, vitamin D supplementation, stopping smoking, and managing fatigue are important for maintaining daily function. Ongoing research into remyelination is focused on developing treatments to repair the damaged myelin sheath around axons. Fact 43. The perception of "I am this body" is constructed from interoception, proprioception, and signals from touch and balance. The insular cortex processes internal bodily sensations, such as the rhythm of the heart, breathing patterns, and the state of the gut, as well as how noticeable these are. The somatosensory cortex generates a representation of the body's surface. The cerebellum and parietal cortex combine information about the position of limbs, and the vestibular system reports on movements involving turning and changes in speed. The rubber hand illusion shows that vision and simultaneous touch can change the feeling of body ownership. The brain accepts this change if the incoming signals are statistically consistent. When temporoparietal areas are stimulated, out-of-body experiences may occur due to a failure to synchronize one's viewpoint with the body's map. The accuracy of interoception is connected to emotions. People who can more precisely feel their heartbeat experience anxiety more strongly, but they also use breathing more effectively to manage themselves. Slow belly breathing, mindfulness practices, and biofeedback improve heart rate variability, a sign of the autonomic nervous system's flexibility and capacity to handle stress. Fact 41. The rapid eye movement, REM, sleep stage is a paradoxical state. During REM sleep, the cerebral cortex is electrically active, eyes move rapidly, and the body is immobilized. Muscle paralysis, or atonia, is caused by a brainstem network, including neurons in the pons, which inhibit spinal motor neurons. This prevents the physical enactment of dreams. In this stage, the amygdala and occipital regions are active, while the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex's regulatory function is reduced. This leads to vivid dream imagery, illogical storylines, and strong emotional experiences. REM sleep is connected to the processing of emotions. After a stressful day, dreams can re-edit memories, reducing their emotional charge without losing factual content. PGO waves, which travel from the pons to the geniculate body and occipital lobe, are also observed, accompanying visual phenomenon during dreams. REM sleep deprivation negatively impacts mood and performance on complex learning tasks. Lucid dreaming is a rare state where the frontoparietal network is activated, enabling the person to realize they are dreaming. Although training techniques for lucid dreaming exist, their effectiveness is limited, and their role in mental health remains an area of ongoing research. Fact 42. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is classified as a neurodevelopmental difference rather than a disciplinary concern. This condition is associated with the operation of frontostriatal networks and the way dopamine and norepinephrine are regulated. Observable behavioral traits include challenges in maintaining focus on a goal, heightened distractibility, impulsivity, and occasional motor restlessness. In decision-making processes, a tendency towards delay discounting is noted, where immediate gratification is subjectively perceived as more valuable than delayed rewards. The initial pharmacological treatments involve psychostimulants, specifically methylphenidate and amphetamine. These medications enhance the availability of dopamine and norepinephrine within prefrontal circuits, thereby improving the signal-to-noise ratio. Non-stimulant alternatives are also available, such as atomoxetine, an inhibitor of the norepinephrine transporter NET, and guanfacine, an alpha-2A adrenergic receptor agonist. Optimal results are typically achieved by integrating medication with behavioral support, structured environments, and the development of planning skills. Misconceptions regarding a sugar-induced cause or the notion that the condition is outgrown are not substantiated by evidence. While individual developmental paths differ, appropriate assistance significantly elevates life quality and positively influences academic and social outcomes. Fact 43. Music captivates the brain unlike almost anything else. Rhythm aligns motor and auditory brain regions, while the basal ganglia and cerebellum anticipate musical phrases. The dopamine system reacts to both the expectation and the resolution of harmonic tensions. This is why goosebumps appear at climactic moments. The emotion is tied not just to the melody, but also to the exact timing of musical surprises. Rhythmic audio stimulation is beneficial for Parkinson's disease. It helps lengthen and steady a person's stride by an external beat complementing the internal rhythm. In cases of aphasia, melodic intonation therapy is utilized. Singing and rhythm bypass damaged speech pathways, boosting the connection between the temporal and frontal lobes. Long-term engagement with music modifies cortical maps and the white matter of neural tracts, speeding up interhemispheric communication. Some individuals develop absolute pitch, the ability to identify musical notes without external references, but this is a rare trait requiring early practice. Even passive listening contributes to emotional regulation and the reduction of physiological stress, provided the tempo and volume are adjusted without causing overload. Fact 44. Brain-computer interfaces translate brain activity into commands. Non-invasive EEG systems read brainwave fluctuations, allowing users to pick letters or cursor, but they are affected by noise and have low data transfer rates. Invasive systems using microelectrode arrays like Utah array and electrocorticography offer clearer signals. By analyzing patterns in the motor cortex, they can decode intentions to move a cursor, grab objects, or mentally write. Speech neuroprosthetics are already converting brain activity into synthesized speech or text for people with anarthria. This restores communication for individuals with locked-in syndrome and severe brainstem damage. However, with these advancements come neuroethical questions. Who owns the raw brain data? How can privacy be protected? And how can imposed stimulations and overly high expectations be avoided? The risks of surgery and the lifespan of implants also limit their use. A realistic approach focuses on assistive technologies and rehabilitation, where the person remains in charge of the operation. Fact 45th. Efficient learning resembles the brain's engineering cycle more than a funneling process. Spaced repetitions enable the hippocampus and cortex to consolidate traces through nightly replay. Task interleaving trains feature recognition and flexibility, going beyond just muscle memory for a single pattern. Retrieval is the core mechanism. Attempting to recall, even with mistakes, strengthens the trace more than passive rereading because it activates the same indexing networks and elicits a beneficial dopamine surprise. The illusion of fluency is misleading. What reads easily may not translate into action. Small, desirable difficulties, such as varying conditions, ungraded tests, or explaining material in one's own words, build more durable, context-independent representations. Physical movement and aerobic exercise increase BDNF levels and improve blood flow, supporting plasticity. Sleep concludes the cycle by stabilizing crucial connections and pruning superfluous ones. Fact 46th. Psychedelics are pharmacological instruments, not magic keys, that profoundly alter brain information processing modes. Their shared target is the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, primarily located on layer V cortical pyramidal neurons. Activation of these receptors leads to increased excitability, enhanced rhythm desynchronization, and a rise in activity entropy. On a network level, the default mode network temporarily unravels, and unusual connections form between remote areas. The brain then depends less on familiar patterns and actively explores new combinations. This is linked to a brief period of increased learning capacity and the reprocessing of ingrained thought patterns, a subject of research in therapies for depression, end-of-life anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. However, the effect is highly dependent on context. The environment, expectations, and support are crucial. Risks, such as anxiety reactions or the exacerbation of psychosis in vulnerable individuals, necessitate strict protocols and medical supervision. This is about a controlled intervention in network operation, not a miracle. Fact 47th. Dyslexia is a persistent difficulty in learning to read despite having normal intelligence and receiving education. It is most often connected to phonological processing, which involves breaking words down into their sound units. Neuroimaging shows less effective work in the left temporoparietal and frontal brain areas, as well as in the visual word form area within the left fusiform gyrus. A common trait is a deficit in quickly naming things and in automating the letter-sound link. Genes contribute noticeably, but language is also a factor. Orthographies with deep spelling, meaning inconsistent letter-sound rules, like English, worsen the symptoms, while transparent orthographies, like Finnish, reduce them. Helpful interventions include structured phonetic programs and multisensory practice started as early as possible. Methods such as colored rulers and eye training exercises have very little supporting evidence because the problem isn't with eyesight. Adults with dyslexia often use coping strategies, and their strengths might be in visual spatial tasks and creativity, showing that profiles vary greatly. Fact 48th. Migraine is not simply a severe headache, but a neurovascular syndrome. With migraine accompanied by aura, cortical spreading depression is activated. This is a slow wave that suppresses activity, and it leads to changes in blood flow and sensitivity. Nerve fibers within the trigeminal system release neuropeptides, especially CGRP. This causes blood vessels to widen and boosts the inflammatory signal, resulting in throbbing pain, nausea, aversion to light, and worsening with physical effort. Triggers are unique to each person: not sleeping enough, skipping meals, bright flickering lights, and hormonal changes. Some women experience more frequent attacks when estrogen levels fall. For acute treatment, triptans, 5-HT1D by 1F, new ditans, 5-HT1F, and GPANTs, CGRP antagonists are employed. For prevention, beta blockers, topiramate, botulinum toxin for chronic conditions, and monoclonal antibodies against CGRP or its receptor are used. Regular sleep, proper hydration, and consistent meal times are simple yet significant methods for reducing attack frequency. This is Fact 49. A concussion is a functional disturbance that happens after a head impact or a sudden change in the head's speed or rotation. On a microscopic scale, it causes an ionic storm. Glutamate is released, potassium leaves cells, ATP pumps use too much energy, and a short metabolic crisis occurs because of reduced blood flow. This results in common symptoms like headaches, foggy thinking, being sensitive to light and sound, feeling slow, and sometimes temporary memory loss, but consciousness isn't always lost. Red flags such as a worsening condition, throwing up multiple times, pupils of different sizes, or weakness in arms or legs mean an urgent check is needed for a possible blood clot inside the skull. The current way to handle it is to rest relatively for 24 to 48 hours, then slowly get back to thinking and moving activities while watching for symptoms. Staying completely inactive for too long can make recovery take longer. Getting hit again before fully recovered is dangerous because of the second impact syndrome. Helmets protect from broken bones and cuts, but they don't completely stop rotational forces. So, preventing injuries by using the right techniques and following rules is just as important as wearing the gear. According to the 50th fact, creativity is not a product of the right hemisphere alone. It is, in fact, the coordinated activity of 3 brain networks. These are the default mode network, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate for generating free associations, the executive network, comprising the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and parietal regions for selecting and polishing ideas, and the salience network, involving the anterior cingulate and insula for transitioning between the other two. Research findings suggest that insights are often preceded by alpha wave changes in the occipital region, which signifies a temporary switching off of distracting sensory inputs, and by brief gamma bursts that occur when a solution is finalized. The incubation period, achieved by shifting focus to another activity or by engaging in physical movement like walking, allows these networks to explore various options without tight control. Novelty in one's environment and moderate constraints can broaden the search for solutions. Nevertheless, an uncontrolled flow of thoughts without critical evaluation is unproductive. The most valuable ideas arise from the swift interplay between idea generation and critique. Extensive practice within a specific domain strengthens the required neural pathways, and REM sleep facilitates the restructuring of connections between seemingly unrelated concepts, explaining the frequent epiphanies experienced in the morning after encountering a mental block the prior day. Fact 51. Acetylcholine is the subtle orchestrator of attention and memory. Cholinergic neurons from the basal forebrain, including Meinert's nucleus, project in a fan-like manner to the cortex and hippocampus. This enhances plasticity on demand, meaning signals help reorganize synapses, intensify the figure-ground contrast, and assist in shifting focus to new things. Muscarinic receptors like M1 change how excitable cortical microcircuits are, while nicotinic receptors work faster and help filter sensory input. This is why nicotine can temporarily improve focus, but it leads to tolerance and addiction. During sleep, acetylcholine is low in slow phases and high in REM sleep, which is thought to be for re-editing memories. Drugs that block acetylcholine can blur memory and cause delirium, especially in older people. On the other hand, drugs that block the breakdown of acetylcholine can help with speech and daily tasks in dementia. This system doesn't work by itself, but without it, the cortex finds it harder to learn and to tell important things from noise. Fact 52nd. Movement originates not in the muscle itself, but in a distributed network. The supplementary motor area is responsible for setting the sequence pattern. Premotor areas are involved in encoding goals into spatial coordinates. The primary motor cortex then converts these spatial goals into impulses that travel down the pyramidal tract. The axons of the corticospinal tract cross over in the brainstem, medulla, which is why the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. Motor cortex neurons are specifically tuned to respond to particular directions and forces. The combined population vector can predict the path of movement. Damage to an upper motor neuron causes spasticity, exaggerated reflexes, and the Babinski sign, whereas damage to a peripheral nerve causes weakness and muscle wasting. Spinal central pattern generators permit walking even when the connection to the cortex is impaired. And training refines cortical maps. For violinists, the area representing finger movements occupies a larger portion of the brain's map. Applying TMS to the motor cortex results in brief muscle twitches, which serves as direct proof of the map's specificity. The brain's capacity to learn movement is lifelong, evolving from initial clumsy attempts to the highly economical and precise movements of a skilled professional. Fact number 53. The corpus callosum is the most substantial bridge linking the brain's hemispheres, composed of hundreds of millions of fibers that synchronize vision, language, and planning. When surgically cut during treatment for resistant epilepsy, the world doesn't shatter, but peculiar two-operator effects become apparent. Information entering the left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere, can be recognized non-verbally, such as through gestures or drawing. Verbal reporting, however, becomes difficult because speech is typically localized in the left hemisphere for most people. The left hemisphere often acts as an interpreter, fabricating plausible explanations for the right hand's actions, which are initiated by the right hemisphere. More rarely, alien hand syndrome occurs, where a limb performs autonomous, conflicting movements, a result of the disconnection of fronto-premotor pathways. In healthy states, the corpus callosum not only connects but also segregates, suppressing mirror symmetries to allow for independent movements. Its thickness and microstructure evolve with the practice of two-handed skills, accelerating interhemispheric information transfer. The 54th fact states that theory of mind, the ability to assign beliefs and intentions to others, depends on a network that includes the temporoparietal junction, posterior superior temporal sulcus, medial prefrontal cortex, and posterior cingulate cortex. A standard test for false belief illustrates its operation. A child learns that someone else can be wrong and predicts their actions using the other person's information, not their own. Neuroimaging reveals that these brain regions activate when reading stories about motivations and when interpreting viewpoints. This network overlaps with the default mode network, which makes sense because thinking about oneself and others involves similar computational tasks. Problems with the control of this system show up in different ways. Individuals with autism may have difficulty automatically reading nonverbal cues, while psychopathy often affects the emotional response to another's pain even when cold simulation abilities are intact. Mentalization is a skill that is developed through context, language, and social experiences. The 55th fact states that consciousness is not a discrete entity like a light bulb, but rather an emergent property of network dynamics. Science has not yet provided a definitive explanation for its exact workings. According to the global workspace theory, an experience occurs when information ignites and spreads throughout the frontoparietal system, thereby facilitating access to memory, speech, and planning. The empirical indicators for this theory are late electroencephalogram or EEG and a marked increase in connectivity. The integrated information theory concentrates on the compression of causal relationships within a system and proposes a metric for integration, though its measurement outside of a theoretical model is difficult. The recurrent processing theory highlights the role of local feedback loops in the sensory cortex. When feedback is sufficiently robust, phenomenal experience arises, without the necessity of frontal ignition. Experiments such as backward masking, binocular rivalry, and studies on anesthesia and deep sleep demonstrate that the equilibrium of long-range connections, temporal coordination, and the capacity for reporting are essential. It is likely that a synthesis of several frameworks will be required to account for the diverse dimensions of conscious experience. Fact 56. Face recognition is a specialized function of the visual system. The fusiform face area, FFA, found in the fusiform gyrus, is highly attuned to the holistic structure of eyes, nose, and mouth. The OFA, located further back towards the occipital pole, processes more specific facial details. The superior temporal sulcus, STS, is involved in tracking movement and expression, such as eye gaze, facial movements, and mouth actions. This specialization leads to certain impairments. Prosopagnosia is a disorder where people cannot recognize familiar faces despite having normal vision for objects and landscapes. It can be present from birth or acquired due to brain damage. A contrasting condition is Capgras syndrome, where facial recognition is intact but the emotional feeling of familiarity is missing, leading individuals to believe their loved ones are imposters or doubles. The Thatcher illusion illustrates the system's reliance on configuration. An inverted and distorted face appears normal for a considerable time. Pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in random patterns like wall sockets or clouds, is an unintended consequence of a highly sensitive system for detecting social cues, which offered an evolutionary advantage. Fact number 57. Stuttering, which is a speech fluency disorder characterized by repetitions, prolongations, and blocks, is not caused by a lazy tongue. Instead, it is linked to neural circuits that manage timing and sensory motor coordination. Research findings show variations in the white matter of the left arcuate fasciculus and distinct patterns of activity in the basal ganglia and supplementary motor area. The neural network responsible for creating syllable sequences experiences disruptions when faced with increased demands. Dopamine modulation also plays a role. For some individuals, dopamine antagonists can decrease the frequency of disfluencies. Furthermore, altered auditory feedback, such as introducing a delay or changing the pitch, can temporarily improve speech smoothness by shifting control to different neural pathways. Singing and participating in choral speech are generally easier as the rhythm and a pre-established pattern provide support. The most effective approach involves speech therapy programs focused on fluency shaping and stuttering modification, combined with strategies to manage anxiety and avoidance. The ultimate objective is not to achieve perfect diction, but to foster confident communication and the ability to control stuttering symptoms in real-world situations. Fact number 58. Disorders of consciousness are categorized along two main lines: wakefulness and awareness. Coma signifies a state where neither wakefulness nor awareness is present. The eyes remain closed and there are no discernible sleep-wake cycles. A vegetative state, also referred to as unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, is marked by open eyes and the presence of sleep-wake cycles, yet without any indication of a meaningful response. A minimally conscious state is identified by occasional but repeatable signs of intentional action, such as tracking a visual target on command or making a yes-no gesture. Locked-in syndrome is a distinct condition where consciousness is preserved, but damage to the brainstem impedes movement, leaving only the ability for vertical eye movements. The diagnostic process involves scales like CRSR, EEG markers such as P300 and mismatch negativity, and sometimes mental imagery techniques using fMRI/EEG, where a patient might respond by imagining activities like playing tennis or walking around their home. TMS EEG is employed to gauge the complexity of the network's response. Treatment options are limited, but rare cases of patient awakening have been reported following zolpidem administration or thalamic stimulation. Crucially, patient care, the prevention of complications, and ethical decisions made by the family and the care team are vital. Fact 59th. Time perception lacks a single chronometer. The brain gauges duration through various mechanisms. For intervals of milliseconds, the cerebellum and sensory motor loops are key. Seconds and tens of seconds are connected to the striatum and the rhythm of cortical oscillators, whose beats converge on the neurons of the striatum, one model being striatal beat frequency. Dopamine affects the speed of internal clocks. Stimulants subjectively accelerate time, while antipsychotics and Parkinson's disease decelerate it, leading to poorer interval reproduction. The insular cortex adds a bodily component to time measurement. The more intense the interoceptive signals, the longer the moment feels. The chronostasis illusion, where a clock's hand appears stationary after a saccade, demonstrates the brain's method of filling visual gaps. Furard's law dictates that we tend to overestimate short intervals and underestimate long ones. Attention and novelty stretch subjective duration, while routine compresses it, proving that time is a calculation, not an emission. The 61st fact explains that memories aren't sealed permanently. When recalled, they become labile and need restabilization, called reconsolidation. In animal studies, blocking protein synthesis after reactivating a memory trace weakened it. For people, the fear element of a memory can be lessened by recalling it and then exposing them during its window of vulnerability, or by giving the beta blocker propranolol. Propranolol doesn't delete the memory, but reduces the body's automatic response. This allows for better treatments for phobias and memories of trauma, with the aim of changing the memory's meaning from threat to a safely experienced event. However, results vary. Not all memories are easily rewritten. The window is short and depends on the context, and the method needs careful execution to avoid harm. The ethical question of whether it's okay to change personal emotional experiences is still unresolved. The sensible conclusion is that memory can change and is edited by experience, especially when we recall it. 61st fact. Thermoregulation and thirst are centralized in the hypothalamus, functioning as a command center. The preoptic area contains temperature-sensitive neurons that determine the body's temperature set point. When infections elevate this set point using prostaglandins, PGE2, fever results. The skin whitens due to vasoconstriction, and the body experiences chills as it strives to reach the new temperature. Antipyretics reduce prostaglandin production, thereby lowering the set point. Osmoreceptors located in the organum vasculosum of the lamina terminalis and the subfornical organ detect increased plasma concentration and initiate thirst. Simultaneously, the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei release vasopressin, which aids in water retention by the kidneys. A decrease in blood volume activates the renin-angiotensin system. Angiotensin II acts on circumventricular organs and enhances the desire to drink and consume salt. The sympathetic system regulates sweating via cholinergic fibers in humans, the widening of skin blood vessels, and changes in heat production. Behavioral actions like seeking shade, wearing clothes, and drinking are integral to this process, where the cortex assists the body in anticipating overheating by using prediction, not just sensor data. Fact 62nd. Hypothalamic pituitary axes transform mental activity and stress into the body's hormonal communication. The typical HPA axis, CRH from the paraventricular nucleus, leads to pituitary ACTH, which then signals the adrenal glands for cortisol. Cortisol's morning peak helps with waking, but chronic excess harms sleep, contextual memory, and immune balance. The TRH-TSH thyroxine axis regulates metabolism and body heat. GnRH is released in pulses, controlling LH, FSH, and sex hormones. The timing of these pulses alters the response. Dopamine suppresses prolactin. Oxytocin and vasopressin are released from the posterior pituitary, affecting birth, breastfeeding, water balance, and social ties. Feedback loops are the main safety feature. Cortisol and thyroxine decrease their own production. Limbic and prefrontal areas, perceiving a threat or a goal, change the system's settings. This is allostasis, where the system stays stable by changing. The long-term consequence is allostatic load, high blood pressure, belly fat, and tiredness. Rhythms, light, food, and stress management are the tools to reset the axes to a low-energy mode. Fact number 63 explains that the brain and the immune system are in constant communication, which can be seen in how a sick person behaves. Feeling sleepy, having less appetite, experiencing body aches, and wanting to be alone are not signs of weakness, but rather adaptive changes. Cytokines like IL-1 beta, IL-6, and TNF-alpha affect areas around the barrier and the vagus nerve, changing how the hypothalamus and monoamine systems work. Microglia in the brain become more active, like guards, cleaning up more and changing how brain connections, synapses, work. A fever is just the most obvious sign. More importantly, motivation and how sensitive we are to rewards change. When someone is obese or under long-term stress, mild body-wide inflammation is connected to feeling tired and having trouble concentrating, often called brain fog. Tryptophan, an amino acid, gets redirected into the kynurenine pathway, meaning less is available to make serotonin, and it creates substances that affect NMDA receptors, which is one way inflammatory anhedonia happens. It is important for the inflammation to go away naturally. If immune cells get through a damaged barrier, the risk of damage to nerve cells increases. Getting enough sleep, moving your body, eating well, and treating sources of inflammation helps this communication get back to normal. Fact 64th. Antidepressants operate not as a joy pill, but through a slow recalibration of neural networks. Selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors rapidly alter mediator levels in synapses, but the clinical effect is delayed. This is because the hippocampus and prefrontal loops need to increase plasticity, shift BDNF signals, and adjust connection architecture. Ketamine provides a rapid improvement within hours by blocking NMDA receptors on interneurons, causing a glutamate surge and AMPA potentiation, which initiates synaptogenesis cascades. The window of enhanced learning it opens offers a chance to consolidate new behavioral patterns. Electroconvulsive therapy remains effective for treatment resistance, likely through a profound network reset. rTMS over the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex alters corticostriatal thalamic dynamics. Psychotherapy reorganizes the same networks from top down through meanings and skills and, in conjunction with pharmacotherapy, yields a more stable outcome. Individualized selection, consideration of side effects, and proper discontinuation to avoid withdrawal syndrome are important. Fact 65th. High sports accuracy is a prediction neurocomputer. The cerebellum builds internal models, pre-calculating the sensory consequences of movements and minimizing error. The basal ganglia reinforce successful patterns, and the motor cortex refines impulses to save micronewtons. The quiet eye phenomenon, a long final gaze fixation before a throw or strike, correlates with reliability because it stabilizes sensory motor alignment and filters noise. Mental rehearsals activate motor networks and improve actual performance, especially if the imagery is detailed in tactile and kinesthetic sensations. Peripheral vision and anticipation move reaction time below pure time. Experience allows starting based on subtle cues. Sleep closes the learning cycle, and moderate aerobic exercise increases BDNF, speeding up skill integration. Caffeine improves alertness and simple reaction speed, but fine motor skills and timing suffer with excess. Each training session works not only on muscles, but also on repeatedly rewiring white matter tracts and synapses. Fact 66th. The process of deciding is not a simple yes or no action, but rather a negotiation between networks responsible for assessment, uncertainty, and control. The orbitofrontal cortex encodes the present cost of various options, taking into account the context and potential outcomes. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors for conflicts, errors, and the effort expended, encouraging a shift in strategy. Dopamine conveys a signal of error in reward prediction, thereby adjusting the perceived value. Serotonin, according to multiple sources, is more significantly involved in patience, experiencing punishment, and refraining from impulsive behavior. Norepinephrine, originating from the locus coeruleus, enhances the readiness to explore new possibilities when uncertainty is elevated, which is visually indicated by pupil dilation. We maintain a balance between exploring new avenues and exploiting existing ones, deciding whether to select a proven path or to take a risk. The framing effect causes the same probability to be judged differently if it is presented as a loss or as a gain. In the Iowa gambling task, patients who have sustained damage to their frontal lobes are inclined to pursue immediate gratification, disregarding future implications. Ultimately, choice is a calculation performed under conditions of noise, where emotions establish priorities and control mechanisms maintain the intended direction. Fact 67th. The brain combines sensory inputs from different modalities to create our perception of reality, and this process is guided by statistical regularities. If a sound arrives slightly ahead of time and from the correct spatial location, it can influence the visual perception, causing it to shift. This is the ventriloquist effect. When two sounds are paired with a single visual flash, many people report seeing two flashes, an illusion that originates in the superior temporal sulcus. A classic illustration is the McGurk effect. The auditory syllable ba can be perceived as da or ga when there is a mismatch between lip movements and the sound itself, because the brain relies on the most informative sensory channel available. The superior colliculi and parietal areas integrate visual, auditory, and tactile information to help us navigate our surroundings. The influence of each sensory channel changes dynamically based on its perceived reliability at any given moment. This explains why making eye contact is more effective in a loud bar, and why many animal species react quickly to a sudden, low-pitched, intense sound. Rhythms play a role in synchronization, making it easier to link what we hear with what we see. Problems with how these sensory weights are adjusted can lead to perceptual distortions, but training can improve this integration process, which is utilized in recovery programs for stroke patients and for individuals with auditory-visual integration issues. Fact 68. Bilingualism involves consistently inhibiting one linguistic code and engaging another, functioning as a practice arena for control mechanisms. The anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex participate in suppressing conflicting lexical operations, with the caudate nucleus facilitating the switch. Consequently, some bilinguals show moderate advantages in tasks requiring interference management and flexibility. This advantage, however, is not uniform and is influenced by factors such as the age at which bilingualism began, the frequency of language use, and social contexts. Individuals who acquire bilingualism early tend to form phonological categories with greater plasticity and find it easier to maintain accents. Those who become bilingual later encounter more difficulty, although their vocabulary and grammar can improve through consistent practice. The act of switching languages incurs a minimal time cost, measured in milliseconds, which decreases with extensive experience. Several studies have suggested a correlation between multilingualism and a delayed onset of dementia at a population level, a phenomenon attributed to cognitive reserve. Nevertheless, the causal link remains uncertain, as educational background and lifestyle habits also contribute. At the microstructural level, studies indicate an enhancement of the arcuate fasciculus and premotor connections, leading to faster articulatory planning. The crucial aspect is not an innate superpower, but rather the sustained cognitive conditioning for managing attention and communication. Fact 69th. Tourette's syndrome is a neurodevelopmental condition marked by motor and vocal tics, usually starting in childhood and reaching its peak severity in early adolescence. Tics are often preceded by a bodily sensation, a sort of preparatory feeling like itching or tension, which is relieved by performing a movement. It is possible to voluntarily suppress tics for a few minutes, but this results in growing discomfort. The basis of the condition lies in the specific characteristics of thalamostriacortical circuits and how habits are modulated by dopamine. Stress and fatigue tend to intensify the symptoms. Common co-occurring conditions include ADHD and obsessive-compulsive symptoms. Coprolalia, which involves involuntary outbursts of swear words, is seen in a minority of individuals and is not what defines the diagnosis. The initial treatment strategy is behavioral therapy, called CBIT, covering habit reversal and trigger management, which teaches patients to perform competing movements and thereby reduces tic frequency. Medications are chosen on an individual basis and may include alpha-2 agonists like guanfacine, antipsychotics in low doses, or sometimes VMAT2 inhibitors. For severe cases that do not respond to treatment, deep brain stimulation of the globus pallidus or thalamus is discussed. The objective is to achieve functional freedom, not a complete absence of movement. Fact 70. The syndrome of spatial neglect serves as a telling example of the difference between seeing and taking notice. Following damage to the right temporoparietal network, an individual might fail to acknowledge the left side of their surroundings. This can result in eating only from the right side of a plate, shaving only half of their face, or drawing lines that leave the left part of a page untouched. This is not a visual impairment. When attention is directed, the patient can perceive an object on the left, but without a prompt, it is missed. Neglect can be personal, affecting one's own body, or impersonal, relating to external space. The phenomenon of switching off occurs when stimuli compete, and neglect can even affect imagination. In a classic experiment, patients described a room forgetting the left side, regardless of their viewing angle. As the right hemisphere is dominant in allocating attention, neglect affecting the left side is more common and more severe. Rehabilitation methods include prismatic adaptation, visual cues, scanning training, and vibrocaloric stimulation to temporarily redirect attention. The dorsal and ventral attention networks illustrate that our mental map of the world is like a controlled spotlight, not a simple snapshot. Fact number 71. Schizophrenia is not a split personality, but a disorder that disrupts the integration of perception, thinking, and motivation. It commonly starts in late adolescence and young adulthood. Some people primarily experience delusions and auditory hallucinations, while others have negative symptoms like limited speech, low energy, social withdrawal, and cognitive problems, such as issues with working memory and processing speed. Biologically, there's discussion about a dopamine modulation imbalance in the striatum, where the salient signal fires too easily, along with problems in glutamate systems, especially in cortical circuits that rely on NMDA receptors. Network studies show glitches in the default mode and connections between the frontal and parietal lobes, which makes it harder to filter internal and external signals. Antipsychotics block D2 receptors and reduce positive symptoms, but they don't help as much with negative and cognitive symptoms. Psychoeducation, family support, cognitive training, and social skills training are beneficial. The progression of the illness differs. Getting help early and consistently improves long-term outcomes. Fact 72. Obsessive-compulsive disorder consists of intrusive thoughts, obsessions, and rituals that temporarily lessen anxiety but reinforce a cycle. In neural networks, hyperactivity is identified in the orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and caudate nucleus within the cortex striatum thalamus cortex loop. This system for quality control gets stuck on checking. Obsession themes vary: contamination, symmetry, doubts about causing harm, moral purity, while insight remains. The person knows the thoughts are excessive but cannot let go. Effective therapy is exposure with response prevention, ERP. This systematic confrontation with fear without the ritual teaches the brain that threats are not realized. Pharmacologically, SSRIs in high doses help, and antipsychotics are added for resistance. In the most severe cases, deep stimulation of the internal capsule/globus pallidus is considered. An emphasis on values and functionality is important. The goal is not to erase thoughts, but to restore freedom of action. Fact 73 explains that post-traumatic stress disorder is not a direct result of trauma, but rather how the brain reprocessed the world following the traumatic event. The amygdala becomes overly sensitive to perceived threats. The hippocampus is less effective at contextualizing memories with specific times and places. And the medial prefrontal cortex has a diminished capacity to inhibit automatic fear responses. This mechanism causes triggers to effectively teleport individuals back to the past, manifesting as flashbacks and nightmares. Sleep, particularly the REM stage, normally aids in processing emotional experiences. But in PTSD, it becomes fragmented, leading to persistent dream recall and increased daytime arousal. Treatment is centered on controlled relearning. Sustained exposure and cognitive memory processing help to recontextualize the traumatic episode within a safe present. EMDR incorporates rhythmic attention stimulation as a supportive measure. Pharmacotherapy involves SSRIs and targeted interventions for sleep and pain, while interventions affecting memory reconsolidation, like beta blockers, are under investigation but are not yet standard clinical procedures. Environmental support and a gradual return to usual activities are as vital as therapeutic interventions. Fact 74. Addiction should be understood not as a failing of willpower, but as a change in the brain's reward learning mechanisms. Psychoactive substances and specific behaviors, such as playing games or placing bets, elevate the dopamine prediction error significantly. Consequently, cues associated with use, the sight of a bottle, the smell of smoke, the route to a familiar place, become hypersensitive and act as potent triggers for craving. Over time, incentive salience, the drive for something without the accompanying pleasure, intensifies, while the control exerted by the prefrontal cortex weakens. The cycle is further entrenched by the development of tolerance and the onset of withdrawal symptoms. Successful interventions acknowledge the biological underpinnings. These include methods like substitution therapy and partial agonists, for instance in cases of opioid addiction, receptor antagonists, naltrexone for alcohol use disorder, and varenicline for nicotine addiction. Behavioral strategies are also crucial, encompassing contingent reinforcement, motivational interviewing, and training in relapse prevention skills. Triggers such as stress, insufficient sleep, or isolation are manageable. The establishment of alternative routines, the formation of social agreements, and the cultivation of a new environment of habits reduce the probability of automatic trigger responses. The overarching objective is not merely to achieve abstinence, but to restore a high quality of life. Fact 75. Mindfulness meditation is about training your attention and your relationship with your experiences, not about trying to empty your mind of thoughts. Neurophysiologically, it boosts top-down control. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex become more active. The amygdala shows less reactivity to stressful stimuli, and the default mode network engages in mind-wandering less often. In the short term, you'll likely see better attention span and metacognition, the ability to recognize when your mind has strayed and gently guide it back. Some individuals also experience an increase in heart rate variability, which signals greater autonomic flexibility. While MRI scans have shown long-term structural changes, these are minor and depend on the specific method and practice frequency. Meditation isn't a universal fix. For acute psychological trauma or depression, it should complement therapy, not replace it. Techniques demanding intense focus might temporarily increase anxiety for vulnerable people, so it's important to choose the right format, such as focusing on breathing, body scanning, or loving kindness. Fact 76. The hippocampus serves not as a simple storage unit, but as an expert in differentiating and linking similar items. At the system's entry point is the dentate gyrus, which processes incoming data, creating sparse representations through pattern separation. This ensures that comparable events, like two alike intersections or two similar classrooms, do not blend together. Subsequently, CA3 becomes active, utilizing its recurrent connections and pattern completion abilities to reconstruct a complete scene from incomplete prompts. CA1 then matches the hippocampus's initial representation with the contextual map from the cortex, noting any new information or mismatches. This structure is also the basis for system consolidation. Over time, the event's index is moved to broader cortical networks, lessening the hippocampus's necessity for semantic memory, although it retains responsibility for episodic vividness for a longer period. This leads to the development of competing models, such as the standard and multiple traces theories. During sleep, sharp waves called ripples replay sequences, reinforcing neural pathways. The presence of schemata, or prior knowledge, facilitates the quicker integration of new data if it fits within existing networks of meaning. Fact number 77. The brain's energy supply is a constant operation of pumps and mitochondria. The majority of ATP is consumed by the Na plus K pump. This pump's role is to eject sodium and re-import potassium after each nerve signal, maintaining the fragile balance of the membranes. Synapses are the most energy-intensive areas. Dense farms of mitochondria bring ATP to vesicles and receptors. When the brain is inactive, it uses most of the body's glucose. This explains why PET scans with 18F-FDG show active metabolic areas, not areas of thought. Astrocytes store glycogen, and when the neural network is active, give neurons lactate, a fast fuel through the astrocyte neuron shuttle. During hunger, childhood, or on a ketogenic diet, ketone bodies like beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate are used. They pass the barrier using monoparboxylate transporters and are burned in neuron mitochondria, which partly explains why this diet helps prevent seizures. Hypoglycemia is dangerous for the brain's calculator, not for someone who likes sweets. Attention and behavior decrease, possibly leading to seizures. The brain needs a constant supply of ATP, regardless of its source. Fact 78. The vestibular system serves as our sixth sense, responsible for measuring rotation and acceleration. It consists of three semicircular canals, positioned at right angles to each other, which detect angular accelerations. Endolymph within these canals causes inertial displacement of the cupula in the ampulla, bending the hair cells. The utricle and saccule, which contain otoliths, crystals of calcium carbonate, perceive linear accelerations and gravity, providing the brain with information about down and the sensation of sliding. The vestibulo-ocular reflex maintains visual fixation on a target with millisecond-level latency, compensating for small head movements. This is why the world does not appear to swim when we walk. A mismatch between the signals from the vestibular canals and vision results in motion sickness and VR sickness. This occurs because the brain cannot reconcile conflicting information. When the eyes indicate movement, we are flying, while the inner ear indicates stillness, we are sitting. A common neurological issue is benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. In this state, otoliths break free and enter the posterior canal, and a head turn triggers a brief, intense episode of dizziness. Epley maneuvers are employed to return these crystals to their correct position. Vestibuloneuritis leads to sudden rotational vertigo accompanied by nystagmus, and the brain needs several weeks to learn to compensate for this condition. In a state of weightlessness, adaptation alters the system's calibrations, and upon returning to Earth, one may experience a sensation of instability as if the ground is still swaying. Fact 79th. Sign languages are complete natural languages featuring phonology, morphology, and syntax distinct from pantomime. The brain processes them using the same network principles as spoken language. Sign language users exhibit activity in brain regions homologous to Broca's and Wernicke's areas, with a dominant left hemisphere. The right hemisphere contributes to spatial grammar and the prosody of facial expressions. Early language exposure is vital. Children denied access to any language during sensitive periods later struggle with abstractions, not due to hearing, but due to delayed language input. In cases of deafness, visual and somatosensory channels partially occupy the cortex, usually processing sound, leading to cross-modal plasticity that heightens sensitivity to movement and peripheral cues. Post-cochlear implantation, age, and the duration of silence greatly influence outcomes. Earlier exposure to structured language, signed or spoken, facilitates network reorganization. Sign plus speech bilingualism creates unique code blending phenomena, affirming shared language control mechanisms. The 80th fact. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is a disease of the upper and lower motor neurons. It leads to a gradual loss of control signals from the brain's cortex to the muscles. Manifestations include muscle twitching, fasciculations, and weakness. Muscle tone becomes spastic. If the disease begins with bulbar symptoms, speech becomes slurred, and the muscles used for breathing become fatigued. The pathology is varied. Some patients develop changes in behavior and speech associated with the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, which places ALS and frontotemporal dementia on a continuum. At the cellular level, aggregates of the TDP43 protein are frequently observed, while mutations in SOD1, C9orf72, and others are less common. The diagnosis is primarily clinical, supported by EMG and the exclusion of other conditions presenting similarly, masks. Among the available medications, riluzole and certain edaravone treatment regimens have been proven to slow disease progression. The core of patient care involves multidisciplinary teams, non-invasive ventilation, nutritional support, and assistive communication technologies such as eye tracking and brain-computer interfaces. Cognitive functions can remain intact for extended periods, but caregiver fatigue and the complexity of ethical choices are significant challenges. Early planning and support are crucial for maintaining a person's autonomy and their ability to communicate for longer durations. Hecho 81. Engrama no es una imagen poética, sino una hipótesis de trabajo que postula que un recuerdo específico se almacena como un conjunto de neuronas con conexiones fortalecidas. En roedores se ha logrado iluminar estos conjuntos mediante la actividad de genes marcadores tempranos, como C-Fos, y se les han aplicado etiquetas moleculares. Posteriormente, se utiliza la optogenética. Si durante el aprendizaje se introducen canales sensibles a la luz y luego se iluminan las mismas células con luz azul, el animal reproduce la reacción condicionada, incluso en un entorno seguro. Por el contrario, si se suprimen estas marcas, el recuerdo es difícil de recuperar. Esto no es borrar la memoria como en el cine. La huella a menudo permanece, pero el camino hacia ella se interrumpe. En humanos, experimentos tan directos no son admisibles, pero datos indirectos, incluida la estimulación de alta precisión, respaldan la idea de núcleos de memoria distribuidos. La conclusión importante es que no recordamos un archivo, sino que reensamblamos un patrón a través de nodos clave de la red. Fact 82nd. Cerebrospinal fluid, a clear aquatorium of the brain, performs the impossible. It turns 1.5 kilograms of tissue into a weightless organ. It is produced by the vascular plexuses of the ventricles, about half a liter daily, with a total volume of around 150 milliliters. The liquor is completely renewed several times a day. The path goes from the lateral ventricles through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, and then into the subarachnoid space, where the fluid washes the gyri and is absorbed into the venous sinuses. The liquor cushions impacts, equalizes the chemical environment, and participates in the removal of metabolites, especially during sleep when the glymphatic flow intensifies. Impaired circulation leads to hydrocephalus. In infants, an enlarged head. In adults, headaches, nausea, and disc edema. A special variant is normotensive hydrocephalus, with a triad of gait, memory, incontinence. Treatment involves shunting or endoscopic ventriculostomy, which restore drainage to the brain's internal waters. Fact number 83 explains that alcohol is not simply a universal relaxer, but a molecule with many effects, influencing several neurochemical processes at once. When consumed acutely, it increases the function of GABA-A receptors, which are inhibitory, and blocks NMDA receptors for glutamate, which are excitatory. This leads to speech slurring, coordination problems, and a feeling of reduced anxiety. The brain's dopamine-based reward system receives a prize, which encourages users to repeat the behavior. The blockage of NMDA receptors in the hippocampus interferes with long-term potentiation, resulting in blackouts, periods where events occur but are not stored as episodic memories. When alcohol use becomes chronic, receptor balances shift, and suddenly stopping can lead to overexcitation, causing symptoms like seizures, tremors, and delirium. Another danger is deficiency. A lack of thiamine, vitamin B1, can cause Wernicke's encephalopathy. Symptoms include unsteadiness, confusion, and issues with eye movement, and Korsakoff syndrome, which involves severe memory loss and confabulations. The established clinical practice is to give thiamine before glucose. Fetal alcohol spectrum is a distinct concern, as ethanol is particularly damaging to a brain that is still developing. Fact 84th. Tools become a continuation of the body, not as a metaphor, but within the neurophysiology of peripersonal space. In the premotor and parietal zones, bimodal neurons are present. These are triggered by both touching the skin and by objects approaching that same zone visually. Following brief practice with a stick or forceps, their receptive fields indeed broaden, leading the brain to treat the tool's tip as the boundary of its own space. This improves accuracy in actions. A surgeon feels a needle more profoundly than their skin. A blind person sees a curb's roughness with a cane, and a tennis player intercepts a ball with a racket as if it were their hand. Body illusions serve as evidence of the map's adaptability. By adding synchronized touches and the correct delay, a virtual limb or a VR avatar is integrated into the body's schema. The drawback, however, is susceptibility to conflicts. Discrepancies in signals cause disruption and awkwardness until the network rebalances the weighting of its channels. Training establishes stability in the expanded schema, and skill becomes economical. Fact 85th. When someone is blind, their visual cortex doesn't shut down. Instead, it takes on new jobs. This shows cross-modal plasticity. For people born blind, the back part of their brain, the occipital region, is actively used for reading Braille and for difficult language tasks, like understanding word parts, morphology, and meanings, semantics. If you use transcranial magnetic stimulation on the back of their head, it can temporarily make it harder for them to read by touch. This directly proves the brain has reorganized. Scans show stronger connections between touch, hearing pathways, and the back of the brain. The brain's white matter structure also shows that these other ways of sensing have been trained for a long time. The timing of development matters. If a child doesn't see from an early age, their visual cortex can easily learn new jobs. But if vision is lost later, the brain doesn't change as much. This doesn't mean they automatically have super hearing. However, with regular practice, they can become very good at figuring out where sounds come from, echolocalization, recognizing voices, and thinking about space without seeing. The brain works based on what the network can compute and what the environment requires, not just on what kind of cortex it is. Fact 86th. Glutamate, the principal excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, transforms into an adversary upon excessive activation, resulting in excitotoxicity. When blood circulation to a tissue region ceases due to ischemia, the pumps on the membrane stop working. Neurons depolarize, leading to glutamate accumulation in the synapses. NMDA receptors are released from their magnesium lock, allowing calcium to enter and initiate a cascade of events. Proteases and lipases become active, the cytoskeleton and membranes degrade, and mitochondria become overwhelmed with free radicals. Astrocytes, which typically clear excess mediator through EAAT1/2 transporters, falter during an energy crisis, thereby closing the loop. Analogous mechanisms are involved in damage from severe trauma, hypoglycemia, and certain seizure conditions. The idea of disabling NMDA seems simple. However, in clinical practice, most direct antagonists have not achieved stable efficacy due to a narrow therapeutic window and side effects. They interfere with plasticity too severely. Where feasible, rapid blood flow recovery, cautious sedation, temperature regulation, and metabolic support, actions to help the network endure the storm, are the saving measures. Fact 87th. The question is whether a neural network encodes information via spike frequency or precise timing. The brain, in practice, utilizes both approaches. The rate code represents meaning through the average frequency of discharges within a population of neurons. Conversely, the temporal code embeds information in millisecond-scale coincidences and the phase of oscillations. In the hippocampus, place cells exhibit phase precession. As an animal traverses a place field, their spikes advance to an earlier phase of the theta rhythm, which saves time for encoding sequences. At the level of learning, STDP, or spike timing-dependent plasticity, is at play. A presynaptic discharge that precedes a postsynaptic one by tens of milliseconds strengthens the synaptic connection, whereas the reverse temporal order weakens it. In the cerebral cortex, the significance lies not in individual cells, but in their collective activity. A population vector predicts the direction of movement, and synchronized packets of neural activity within the gamma band integrate features into a cohesive image. The network maintains a balance between excitation and inhibition at the threshold of instability, which allows it to remain responsive to subtle shifts and avoid chaotic states. This condition is sometimes observed in experiments as neural avalanches with power law distributions signifying operation in a critical regime. Fact 88th. Memory consolidation is a molecular drama at the dendritic spine. Calcium, via NMDA receptors, opens long-term potentiation, activating CAM kinase and cascades to CREB, the master transcription factor for plasticity genes. Proteins aren't distributed randomly. A weak stimulus marks a synapse with a tag, a synaptic tag. A nearby strong stimulus starts the synthesis of plasticity products, which are then captured by tagged connections. This tagging and capture process links events temporally. Many dendrites have their own ribosomes, translating pre-delivered mRNA locally to create proteins on demand. Spine shape is crucial. Thin spines are labile and search, while mushroom spines are stable and retain memory longer. Epigenetic factors like histone acetylation and DNA methylation change gene accessibility, explaining how single learning events can leave a lasting imprint. Conversely, mechanisms of long-term depression shift the balance if a connection has more noise than signal. Fact 89th. Empathy is dual-natured. There's hot empathy, which is feeling another's pain, and cold empathy, which is understanding another's mind. The first type is supported by the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex. These regions activate when experiencing personal pain or observing another's pain, leading to the concept of social pain, signifying a partial overlap with physical pain. The second type, mentalization, involves the temporoparietal junction and medial prefrontal cortex, where we create models of beliefs and intentions. Neuromodulators act with subtlety. Endogenous opioids lessen both physical and social pain. Dopamine imbues helping with value. Oxytocin can boost trust in one's own group, but doesn't guarantee goodwill toward everyone, as context is key. Chronic loneliness reconfigures the default mode network and is associated with increased inflammation markers, revealing another link between immunity and sociality. Compassion training and practices of caring attention yield small yet reproducible changes in behavioral metrics and the activity of corresponding nodes, illustrating the plasticity of the brain's social network. The 91st fact highlights that hemispheric dominance is statistical, not a fixed law. The majority of right-handed individuals have their speech centers in the left hemisphere, whereas left-handed individuals more frequently show right hemisphere or bilateral speech organization. If the brain's language region is impaired at an early age, there is a higher probability that the opposite hemisphere will take over these tasks. This is aided by sensitive developmental periods and extensive connections between the hemispheres. In extreme scenarios, such as in children with epilepsy that doesn't respond to treatment, hemispherectomy is performed, meaning one hemisphere is either removed or functionally isolated. The brain, especially in early childhood, can achieve a good level of independent functioning, supporting abilities like walking, playing, and basic speech. However, deficits in fine motor skills and spatial abilities might remain, depending on the side affected. Adult brains also exhibit plasticity, but it comes at a greater cost, and the established alternative routes are less efficient. White matter, including the arcuate fasciculus, the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus, and the corpus callosum, creates the channels for functional relocation. The conclusion is plain and encouraging. Specialization exists, but the brain constructs bypasses when the main routes are blocked. Fact 91. Wakefulness is sustained not through willpower but via chemical mechanisms. A primary mechanism involves orexin, also known as hypocretin, a peptide produced in the lateral hypothalamus. Neurons that produce orexin receive signals related to biological rhythms, energy levels, and emotional states. These neurons then project extensively to the noradrenergic, serotonergic, dopaminergic, and cholinergic systems, thereby stabilizing the sleep-wake cycle. A breakdown in the orexin system leads to narcolepsy with cataplexy. In this condition, wakefulness becomes unstable, and components of REM sleep intrude into the waking state. This can manifest as sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, or sudden loss of muscle tone during moments of strong emotion, like laughter or joy. Patients with this disorder exhibit low orexin levels in their cerebrospinal fluid and a significant loss of the corresponding neurons in their brain tissue, with observed associations with immune markers. Treatment is focused on managing symptoms, establishing a regular daytime sleep schedule, using stimulants such as modafinil to promote wakefulness, and administering the sodium salt of oxybate to consolidate nighttime sleep and control cataplexy. The fundamental objective is to restore the system's stability, which is normally maintained by the orexin support. Fact 92. The brain's understanding of numbers doesn't start with the multiplication table, but with approximate number. This is an ancient system for estimating quantities located in the parietal lobes, especially in the intraparietal sulcus. We can instantly subitize 1 to 4 objects, and then counting and attention are activated. Sensitivity to quantity follows Weber's law. The larger the set, the less distinct the relative increase. The symbolic level, using digits and words, is built upon later and connects to the frontoparietal pathways and language centers, enabling the brain to link a symbol to a quantity. Damage to the left inferior parietal region leads to dyscalculia. The typical Gerstmann syndrome combines acalculia with agraphia, finger agnosia, and a disturbance in left-right orientation, which hints at the location of these functions. For children, specific dyscalculia involves persistent difficulties with math facts and procedures even when their overall intelligence is normal. Explicit instruction and strategies, breaking down tasks into modules, and visualizing quantities are helpful. Mathematics is not an inborn module, but a combination of approximate number, attention, language, and working memory. Fact 93. Déjà vu is a brief glitch in the sense of familiarity, making a new place feel as if it has been experienced before. Neurobiologically, this occurs due to a desynchronization between the familiar cue and the recall mechanism. The pararenal cortex is responsible for recognizing familiarity based on features, while the hippocampus reconstructs episodes with their context. If familiarity is triggered without a complete episode, the brain might tag the situation as already happened, even without the specific details, causing the feeling to fade quickly. In temporal lobe epilepsy, déjà vu often appears as an aura caused by a localized electrical discharge in the medial temporal structures that briefly signals familiarity. There's also the opposite effect, jamais vu, where the familiar suddenly feels strange. This can happen with close people, leading to phrases like, "I think I've heard this," and "I think I've seen this," for sounds and events. These effects are not supernatural memory events, but rather byproducts of the brain's prediction system, which saves time by marking patterns as already met. Sometimes this marking is too eager, resulting in a false sense of the past without an actual memory. Fact 94th. Hallucinations are not solely indicative of psychosis. When the input of information is significantly diminished, the brain begins to self-generate visual content. Charles Bonnet syndrome presents as vivid, complex visual perceptions in individuals experiencing severe vision impairment, yet maintaining sound judgment. These visions can include faces, patterns, or animals, and the person often acknowledges their unreality. This is termed a release phenomenon. Visual cortex areas, deprived of their usual sensory signals, become hypersensitive and activate on their own, akin to a cortical phantom. Auditory parallels exist, such as musical hallucinosis in cases of hearing loss, where tunes manifest in silence. In both situations, understanding the phenomenon, improving sensory input via spectacles or hearing devices, ensuring good illumination, and mitigating isolation are helpful. Sometimes mild excitation modulators are utilized. A vital distinction from delusions is the retention of critical awareness. The individual understands the source of their visions. The aim, therefore, is not to expel these visions, but to rebalance the network's input and internal noise, thereby ceasing the need for automatic visual augmentation. Fact 95th. Sleep spindles are short rhythmic trains in the sigma band, around 11 to 16 Hz. They flash during the N2 sleep stage and mirror the dialogue between the thalamus and the cortex. Their generator is the thalamic reticular nucleus. Inhibitory neurons set the pulse, cortical networks respond resonantly, and a wave rolls across the hemispheres. Spindles are tied to memory consolidation. The richer the spindle activity and the more accurately it is nested within slow-wave phases, the better daytime traces are transferred from the hippocampus to the cortex, especially factual knowledge and motor skills. Children have more spindles, and they are shorter. With age, frequency, and topography change. Individual differences correlate with learning metrics. Benzodiazepines make spindles larger, but don't always improve memory. It's important how rhythms fit with slow oscillations. In noisy environments, spindles help insulate the cortex from disturbances. The thalamus's door closes just enough to let the network fix connections without waking up to every sound. Fact 96th. The brain's wiring diagram, the connectome, is built up bit by bit and looks like outer space at a microscopic scale. Complete diagrams are available for simple systems. The nematode, with its about 302 neurons, and the fruit fly larva with several thousand cells. For mammals, only sections are currently available. Millimeter cubes of the cortex and retina, built from electron microscopic slices tens of nanometers thick. Machine vision assembles this material, but segmentation errors still require human input. Even in such fragments, it is clear how uneven synapses are, how an axon makes many branches, and how glial extensions penetrate everything, changing local exchange. A complete human connectome is a petabyte-scale task and will take years. Even then, a single wiring scheme is not enough. The strength and plasticity of contacts, modulators, rhythms, and metabolism are a dynamic addition to the map. Connectomics promises a list of parts, but to assemble behavior, operating instructions, and environmental context are also needed. Fact 77. Neurosurgery can now communicate with the brain during surgery to preserve its functions. When removing tumors or epilepsy-causing areas near speech or motor regions, a wake craniotomy is performed. The patient, given local anesthesia, is asked to count, name pictures, or move fingers. The surgeon gently stimulates cortical and white matter areas with electrical currents. If stimulation causes speech to stop, word substitutions, paraphasias, or weakness, a gentle bypass is used. Dynamic mapping of each millimeter. This method stems from Penfield's classic work and has been improved. It was found that language is distributed across a network, and critical elements include not only cortical spots, but also pathways like the arcuate fasciculus and the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus. Importantly, each person's brain pattern is unique, and neuroplasticity allows for some functional rewiring before and after surgery. The result is more radical removal with less neurological deficit, a vivid reminder that the brain is a flexible infrastructure, not a static map. According to the 98th fact, the notion of a taste map on the tongue, placing sweet at the front, bitter at the back, and salty and sour on the sides, is a myth originating from textbooks of the previous century. In reality, receptors for all basic taste qualities are distributed across the entire tongue surface, with differences mainly in their density and specific types. Umami is encoded by T1R1/T1R3 receptors, sweet by T1R2/T1R3, and a large group of T2R receptors is responsible for recognizing bitterness. Salty and sour tastes are mediated by ion channels. The heat from chili peppers and the cold from mint are not tastes, but rather the function of the trigeminal system, which handles pain and temperature. Capsaicin activates TRPV1 and menthol activates TRPM8, creating the perception of warmth and coolness. The astringency experienced with red wine is due to the interaction of saliva and proteins, not a separate taste category. Genetics can alter detection thresholds. For example, variations in the TAS2R38 bitter receptor gene make some individuals supertasters who more acutely sense bitterness and may consequently avoid foods like Brussels sprouts. A substantial part of what we refer to as taste is actually derived from olfaction through the nasopharynx, which is why nasal congestion impairs the perception of a dish's nuances, even though the tongue itself remains functional. Fact 99th. The retina is an outward projection of the brain, acting as the primary visual computation unit. Light falling on photoreceptors is locally processed via a cascade of horizontal and amacrine cells. These cells perform background subtraction and contour accentuation. Lateral inhibition, for example, generates Mach bands. Bipolar cells segregate signals into on and off channels for light and shadow. Some amacrine neurons contribute sensitivity to the direction of motion. Specialized ganglion cells, termed looming detectors, are sensitive to approaching threats, and iPRGCs, responsive to blue light, calibrate circadian rhythms. The brain receives a compressed stream of features, not raw photo input, indicating where light changed, edge movement direction, size, and contrast. This explains its vulnerabilities. A fine grid of light pulses can deceive motion detectors. Flickering and unnatural light frequencies fatigue the filtering network. The retina resolves some recognition tasks before cortical input, saving resources and making us faster than any camera without pre-processing. Fact number 100. Individuals excelling in memory contests confirm the brain's preference for structure. Their remarkable memory skills are not attributed to innate photographic recall, but to methods like the method of loci, which involves constructing mental palaces to house facts within known environments. fMRI studies indicate increased activity in the brain's navigation systems, including the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, as well as enhanced connections to visual processing areas. This allows numbers and lists to be conceptualized as items situated along a route. Encouragingly, training newcomers using this same method leads to swift memory improvements and shifts in activity patterns within these specific brain hubs. The brain readily integrates this strategy as an additional layer independent of any unusual anatomical predispositions. In practical, everyday applications, this method proves beneficial for memorizing addresses, lectures, or foreign language flashcards. The richness of the created mental environment, encompassing sensory details like smells and rhythm, directly correlates with the ease of indexing and retrieving information. While this approach does not eliminate the possibility of errors when dealing with vast amounts of information, it underscores a fundamental principle. Memory is best served by meaning, order, and clearly defined pathways for retrieval.